Our program today is Naturalistic Transcendentalism by Dr. Peter Bishop. Naturalistic Transcendentalism ties together natural discoveries from a philosophical point of view, drawing from his work published in the Essays in the Philosophy of Humanism. Dr. Peter Bishop will start from the transcendentalism of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was interested in the human capacity for intuition and other religious experiences. But we'll look at this from the 21st century in the 21st century naturalism. Dr. Bishop is a graduate of MIT and worked as a software writer in Silicon Valley. He was an active member of the Humanist Community in Silicon Valley for many years before moving to the East. So Peter, if you'll come forward and give us your best.
So hopefully people can hear me now. After a lifetime of humanist activism, I decided to transition out of my career in high technology into humanist philosophy. I decided to approach humanist philosophy as I had approached high technology, to think everything through from first principles. I've now discovered several things that I think are important philosophical perspectives for the 21st century. I can tie all of my discoveries together into a neat package by establishing a new school of philosophy called Naturalistic Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism was an important movement that arose early in the 19th century, prior to Darwin publishing The Origin of Species. It arose out of the Enlightenment, in which the importance of natural law in the working of the universe was recognized. Ralph Waldo Emerson was trained as a minister before beginning his work as a philosopher. In his first philosophical work, Nature, Emerson talked about his desire to achieve revelations. As he explored further how he could experience revelations, he soon talked about the human faculty of intuition. Emerson saw intuition as a key religious experience of knowing what is right, but without using a scientific reasoning process. Transcendentalism emphasized the importance of human intuition in modern life, but was not opposed to the idea that human intuition is part of nature. As the Transcendentalists continued to think about human intuition and the role of human intuition plays in the forming of human judgment and the setting of goals, writers such as Thomas Carlyle, who lived from 1795 to 1881, talked about intuition being a phenomenon of natural supernaturalism. After Darwin published The Origin of Species, many people misunderstood the naturalistic leanings of transcendentalism's origins. As science and the philosophy of science continued to develop into the 20th century, people stopped thinking along transcendentalist lines and began to think about things from a more humanist perspective. Humanist thinking downplayed the importance of human intuition in favor of reasoning and in favor of conclusions about how to live life that are closer to everyday applicability. As we look at these issues today, our naturalism is much more complex than it was in the early 19th century. It is now time to admit that human intuition is important in two ways. First, it plays a central role in the making of human judgments and is therefore worthy of study. Second, it is a very important part of the subjective life of human beings. It even underlies human creativity, which is utilized by scientists as they propose new hypotheses. Today, naturalism is so oriented toward scientific thinking that modern science has declared that human intuition should not be studied until we can understand the natural law that causes it to work. Naturalistic transcendentalism takes exception to this view and declares instead that it is appropriate to study human intuition using the most powerful observations that exist of human intuition, our subjective observations of our inner beings. Modern naturalism declares our human being and all our human experiences to be natural phenomena that are not well understood in detail. There is still debate about which branch of science is most important to shedding light on how human intuition and the rest of our subjective being works from a scientific perspective. It is appropriate to take up this line of thought, more or less where the Transcendentalists and some other philosophers of the early 19th century left off, but from a 20th century perspective, in order to study the subjective human being and one of its most powerful faculties, human intuition. Questions abound from what role human intuition should play in our personal philosophies to understanding the nature of the humanities. Thinking since the early 19th century has resulted in a triumph of philosophy in a mature philosophy of science. Perhaps if we pick up from where the Transcendentalists left off, we can form an equally significant philosophy of the humanities. For now, let us revisit the Enlightenment and look at a few select issues that were important at the time. The idea that everything happens in the world is due to the working of natural law became a founding principle of the Enlightenment. It was given great impetus when Newton published the Principia Mathematica in 1687, outlining the mathematical principles of classical mechanics and the law of gravity, which, when combined, were able to explain the orbits of all of the planets and moons in our solar system. Even before Newton's discoveries were published, René Descartes had emphasized the importance of questioning everything, observing the external world, and using our very best skills at thinking to derive the theories of how the external world was working. In addition, however, Descartes developed the idea of mind-body dualism, that although the human mind arises from the functioning of the human brain, the mind itself is not like other things and exists separately from the brain. Most important to Descartes was the direction of causality. In nature, events are caused by the laws of nature. Descartes was convinced that there were no natural laws that caused our minds to arrive at the conclusions they reach. He felt that it was very important that human beings be free to follow their reasoning wherever it led. To him, the human mind causes us to do what we do because we decide to do it. And this required our minds to be fundamentally different from the rest of nature. This idea is part of what is meant when we talk about Descartes' metaphysics. Descartes died nearly 40 years before Newton published the Principia. By the mid-18th century, after Newton's ideas had been well digested, a new philosopher, David Hume, picked up from where Descartes left off and made a more modern attempt to cover the ground covered by Descartes. By now, the concept of the mechanical universe operating by the laws of nature was a widely held view among the philosophers of the Enlightenment. By this time, the metaphysics of Descartes was being declared to be a failure because he overemphasized the importance of the imagination and the will in the kind of reasoning used by scientists. Hume wrestled with the same fundamental problem. Is the scientist free to follow his thinking, or is his thinking caused by natural law? On the one hand, it was fairly clear that the human brain is part of nature and that it operated by natural law, and that the human mind arose out of the operation of the brain. But for Hume, the key question was more a question of whether people, philosophers, and scientists are free to make the choices they make, assuming they're not in prison or being forced in some way. Hume concluded that people could only be held to be morally responsible for their actions if they were free to choose their actions. Furthermore, Hume really wanted to grant that scientists and philosophers were most able to make major headway in their thinking when they appeared to be free from external influences to their thinking processes. Hume was never able to show clearly how these two apparently contradictory properties of the mind could be reconciled. He was satisfied with declaring people to be free to make choices and to follow their own thoughts without being concerned about how this happened in the world. Although he did try to explain it, but his attempts were not really successful. Ralph Waldo Emerson enrolled in Harvard College in 1817, whereupon he started reading David Hume and learning all about Enlightenment ideas. In 1819, William Ellery Channing gave his sermon, Unitarian Christianity, in which he laid out the theological principles of Unitarianism. This document is remarkable in that it reveals the nature of religion in the opinion of the religious liberals of the day. At no time does he argue that Unitarian theology is more consistent with our observations of the world than the theology of the Trinity. Rather, he argues for which theology will cause the members of the church to live better lives, choose better goals, and be better able to achieve their goals. He states that he wants to encourage his parishioners to use reason as they think about these issues, and he feels that Unitarian theology will make more sense to these people and will help them achieve their goals better than the theology of the Trinity. In 1820, while Emerson was at Harvard College, he started writing a journal entitled The Wide World. After Harvard, he taught at his brother's school for young ladies for a few years before enrolling in Harvard Divinity School in 1825, which produced many Unitarian ministers. Ralph Waldo Emerson continued to learn more about the ideas of the Enlightenment, while in an environment in which religion rather than science was his focus, but in which divinity students were encouraged to think for themselves. It was an environment in which change was in the air. What did the changes in thought during the Enlightenment mean for religion in the 19th century? In October of 1826, Emerson was licensed to preach to Unitarians. Within 5 years, his first wife and his brother died of tuberculosis. He then sailed to Europe on Christmas Day in 1832, where he traveled through most of 1833, meeting John Stuart Mill and Wordsworth, among others, and establishing a lifelong friendship with Thomas Carlyle. And at this point, he had decided to stop being a minister. A couple of years after returning from his trip to Europe, and while Darwin was still visiting the Galapagos Islands, Emerson published his first major work, Nature, in 1836, in which he declared a major theme of his life's work. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs? There are new lands, new men, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. It's easy to forget that this was said at a time when Enlightenment thought had a very mechanistic view of the laws of nature, except that almost nothing was known about biology. This point is key if we are to understand what Emerson was talking about when he talked about beholding God and nature. In Enlightenment terms, beholding includes what occurs when a scientist observes phenomena in the external world. Although it also refers to not just observing, but also experiencing in a more spiritual manner. Thus, God is beheld, that is, observed and experienced by human beings. Not enough was known about the brain, biology, or the true nature of the powers of the human spirit to have a more scientific word for the widespread experience of God that prevented Descartes, Hume, Emerson, and even Thomas Paine from declaring that God did not exist. Emerson, however, had become sufficiently steeped in the philosophy of David Hume to realize that this experience was an observation by human beings. Emerson did not have the skill or interest to ask, what is it an observation of? Instead, I think Emerson, in this introduction to nature, is declaring that he wishes to explore these experiences, especially from a modern perspective that takes into account the new thoughts of the early 19th century. Although Emerson had decided to stop being a minister, I suspect that he had decided to turn toward what we now call research and development, but to do this for religion. I think Emerson was concerned that the Unitarian approach did not go far enough. Most of the work in biology at this time was observing, describing, and classifying all of the plants and animals in the world. Emerson's statement in Nature can be interpreted as declaring his intention to explore human experiences, whether religious or non-religious, from the perspective of the Enlightenment, to generate new poetry and to articulate new revelations about our relation to the universe from the viewpoint of the Enlightenment. As I look at this from the 20th century, however, I'm inspired to return to a fundamental issue that both Descartes and Hume struggled with. What is the nature of the human spirit and the observer of science, that actor that appears to be the cause of its decisions, which then result in action? Our technologies did not start giving us insight into how this might work until nearly the middle of the 20th century, with the arrival of the computer age. Finally, we saw technologies that could perform simple reasoning, could recognize objects in visual fields, could decide between alternative actions, and could carry out decisions once they were made. These technologies were all computer technologies. The achievements that were most similar to relatively simple tasks carried out largely by our brains were all coming from the field of artificial intelligence. Philosophers did not want to accept that information processing technology had any relationship to the human spirit. Even John Searle, as he struggled to understand how human consciousness works, preferred to claim that human consciousness was arising from biological phenomena, rather than going beyond this observation to identify the information processing properties of the human brain as the phenomena that were underlying the formation of consciousness within the brain. It is time to revisit this question. In order to do so, however, we must start by accepting the validity, as John Searle has done, of our subjective observations of our own beings. We would prefer observations that were more objective, but these observations are good enough to allow us to make significant headway in understanding the nature of the human being. The challenge is to be careful in the judgments we make about just how much we have learned that might be useful to other people and not just to ourselves. The first step is to acknowledge that the human spirit is real. Just as science requires observations of phenomena that we declare to be real, we must demand to know what observations of the human spirit we have made. The observations are multitudinous. As we search all of human literature, each book that talks about observations of the personal feelings and the spirit of the writer is an observation that has been made and recorded of the writer observing his or her own subjective being. If we interpret these observations as observations and do not leap to conclude that we know what they were observations of, we can remain on solid scientific footing. We can declare that something has been observed that we call the human spirit without really knowing much more about it. The challenge is not to leap past these primary observations unduly. We face a challenge that many modern thinkers are not familiar with. We are unable to even define what we mean by intuition clearly. As we move forward from this starting place, we will try to understand more clearly what we are talking about, with an eventual goal of identifying the natural laws that cause the phenomenon that we have observed and found to be interesting. The next question is, what is the most important function of the human mind in the life of a person? This also is relatively simple, especially from an AI perspective. To make decisions about what actions the person will take in life. In addition, people observe the world and try to figure out how it is working. Scientists use their minds in creating the starting points for scientific work. Scientists observe phenomena in the external world and then propose hypotheses to explain how these phenomena work. As a technologist with training in artificial intelligence, I think I bring a new perspective when I ask the question, what does our thinking look like when we make a choice? It is obvious to me that we use concepts such as values and priorities as we do this thinking. A central long-term task in our lives is to establish a value system that is basically a list of values. As we start to consider all of the different things that we are considering doing in our lives, we take each of the possible action and evaluate it relative to our values, and then place it in priority order with all of the other things we are doing in our lives. We then start working on the highest priority tasks first, working our way down the list until we run out of time or other resources. The tasks that cannot be done then fall off the bottom of the priority list. A key property of this kind of thinking is that each action that we are evaluating will presumably promote some of our values, but it will also have a negative impact on others of our values. It is easy for values to conflict with each other. Sometimes any action that promotes one of our values will have a negative impact on another of our values. This occurs whenever the values themselves are in conflict with each other. The natural reaction of a mathematician to this kind of situation is to declare that the system itself is flawed, that we must remove the conflicting values in order to understand properly our true values. Continuing my observations, using my training in artificial intelligence, however, the question arises of how did we arrive at the list of values in our value system? It is at this point that we start to leave reason and mathematics behind and start to depend more and more on our feelings. From an artificial intelligence perspective, emotions are an interesting subsystem within the human brain that appears to be a primitive way of making decisions about what to do that is surprisingly similar to the more conscious system that I was talking about. The emotions themselves can be viewed as doing the analysis I describe above, but at a nearly unconscious level. The person selects the next action to perform based on competition between different levels of feeling of desire or other emotions that move the person to act. The more intellectual version of this, using actual value systems, seems, from an artificial intelligence perspective, to be another layer of the same type of analysis, but one step removed from the emotions. The task of constructing the value system would then be more directly related to our emotions, but would also engage our reasoning, as we do what we can to formulate values with minimal amounts of conflict between the different values. We add values to our system that our reasoning has proposed and our emotions have validated. Finally, as we get ready to choose an action, our reasoning attempts to evaluate our alternatives relative to our values. When two different alternatives have evaluations that are close to one another, our emotions will help us in the final steps of evaluation to select the alternative we will act on. At this point, it is interesting to return to the way Emerson might think about things. Descartes had emphasized the importance of the imagination in scientific thinking. Emerson approached all of these questions from more of a religious perspective, in which ministers are concerned about the moral systems that people also use while making decisions. Religious people know that people have an awareness of what is right and wrong. We sometimes call this our conscience. But at the beginning of this paper, I talked about human intuition. As we observe our subjective beings, many of us experience having a good idea about a problem we are thinking about leap into our mind without our having carefully built up the pieces of the idea, as we often have to do. We tend to describe such an experience by saying that we got the idea intuitively or through inspiration. From a 21st century perspective, it is obvious that such ideas are created by our brain, but that they arise within our brain in a way that is different from when we create ideas through a reasoning process. Since we do not observe how these ideas are formed, we cannot be sure how they came about. Standard scientific method requires that if we cannot observe the construction of something, then we should withhold judgment about how it was constructed. From an artificial intelligence perspective, it is not at all surprising that some of our ideas are created by processes in our brain that we cannot observe. Rather, the artificial intelligence worker realizes that performing reasoning in such a way that we can watch the steps in the reasoning process is more of a surprise, because this requires mechanisms in the brain that can perceive some of our thinking processes. The human intuitive capacity, however, is very important as we think about people living lives from a subjective point of view. It means that if we ever develop a theory of how the human mind works, it must include an explanation of how intuitive thoughts are created. Emerson preferred the term intuition over Descartes' term imagination, to describe the origin of ideas that scientists need to identify new hypotheses to work on. Scientists have also learned how to use standard reasoning process to help them create hypotheses. So we must be careful not to overemphasize the role of intuition even in this process. It is not correct, however, to declare that new hypotheses arise only from conscious reasoning. Intuition is important in this task. Now, I'm afraid that I can't just read you the rest of my article because it is going to be way too long, so I'm going to try to summarize it substantially. And that is that once we have done this basic idea of realizing, wait a minute, there is a way whereby human intuition and the human spirit, and by human spirit, I really mean exactly the same thing that John Searle refers to as consciousness. It's just that John Searle has to go to great length in order to explain that by consciousness, he means things that, he includes things that some psychologists in the past have called the unconscious. And therefore, I think his term is not a good term, because psychologists would say, well, that's not consciousness. And so to my way of thinking, the term human spirit is a much better way of encapsulating not just the consciousness that we are very aware of, but also what includes our intuitions and all the rest of the activity of our brain. And so just calling, and also we experience ourselves. I am, okay? I think, so I know that I am. And that experience of being a being, science tells us that it is beginning to appear that this is an emergent phenomenon that emerges from information processing once the information processing has certain characters that then support the experience of subjective life. So the human spirit, our experience of our being itself, is part of the phenomenon we are interested in. It must operate by natural law. What are the natural laws that cause it to work? Okay. Now, once you've realized all this, then it turns out that there's another thing that's going on about scientific thinking. And that is, there's been this incredible battle between science and the humanities. And so there's this wonderful essay, or that is dialogue, in Jacob Bronowski's book, Science and Human Values, called The Abacus and the Rose, that is a dialogue between an administrator and a scientist and a humanities person, and they're going to a scientific conference, and they're all talking to each other, and they're talking about who is better at doing things, and they're discussing the nature of the humanities, the nature of science, and the humanist of these, that is the academic humanist, the non-scientist, is then able to do a rather good job of explaining the difference between what the scientists are doing and what the people in the humanities are doing. And it's possible to take that and to realize, wait a minute, the real difference here is that science is all about studying the world outside of ourselves, and if it studies the subjective life, it's studying someone else's subjective life. But that the subject matter, and what is the impact of the subject matter on the subjective lives of people, is totally irrelevant to the field. Whereas in the humanities, that is completely different. In humanities, the subject matter of the humanities and of the arts is what is the impact of this academic work on the subjective lives of the people who know about your discipline and your studies and your areas, okay? And so that is a key difference. between the sciences and the humanities. And to my way of thinking, we need a philosophy of the humanities that will explore that more carefully. All right, well, that really covers things. It turns out I also have, this leads to, and especially that second point of view starts leading to a similar acknowledgement or understanding of the nature of religion itself, and to realize that religion really is not about theories of the objective world, the world outside. It is all about helping people to live from a subjective point of view. And that therefore the key religious issue is, what should our relationship be to the world outside of ourselves? And I would suggest that in the 21st century, there's a very simple answer that all religions should adopt, and that the Catholics now claim to have adopted. And that is that if you want to know something about how the world is working, you ask a scientist. And if the scientist tells you that they know how it's working, then you say, okay, then that's how it's working. If the scientist says they don't know, they kind of know what it's doing, then you say, well, we kind of know what it's doing. And if they say, well, we have no idea, then you say, we have no idea. It turns out that in the early 19th century, having this be the religious answer was completely unacceptable to the subjective lives of the people of the time. In the 21st century, I believe that has changed. I have believed that that strategy is now subjectively sufficient, and that that is able to tell you enough about the world so that you can live and breathe and go to work in the morning. All right, well, that concludes my remarks, and so thank you. So presumably we have some questions now.
So raise your hands and I'll pass the mic around. All right, let's start here.
Now, if I were to comment on what we know about mutations of the mammals, I would say that we are an accident. And we are no more important, our brain, than say, a giraffe's long neck. Now, if I were to invoke Mother Nature would say, we are no more important than, say, a mosquito. You know, life of all forms is a miracle, absolute miracle. Now, I will agree with you that since we are here, we ought to make use of this brain. But if you read the morning paper, it is very discouraging. Don't read the paper or look at the TV. We are hopeless. In the long run, the solution, in my opinion, is extinction. And we're taking care of that, no matter what you say about your hope for the human animal. I think we're impossible. Thank you. God has spoken.
Well, thank you, Bob, and all of you who wish to go extinct may follow his lead, okay? However, I would suggest that when you talk about the question of importance, in order for things to be important, this is relative to what choice are we going to make. And the objective world does not make choices. It is, okay? What entities make choices are entities that have subjective lives. Therefore, the question is important to whom? And the key answer is, well, the most important thing about important to whom for you is what is important to you. And so, now sometimes we would like our sense of importance to be more than just ourselves. And we are able to do that to some extent. But ultimately, we have to realize that the question of values is a subjective question, and there must be a mind that is relative to what is going on. And so that's part of my comment. Go ahead.
When you talk about, excuse me, intuition being a basic human property, and one thing that it does is tell right from wrong, how do you explain conflicting intuitions? For instance, we have a great deal of negative, we feel like it's wrong to kill and eat people, whereas those native tribes who are cannibals think it's perfectly fine to kill and eat people. And both of those arise from their natural, what you would call intuition, I guess, or I might think of as culture. What do you have to say about that?
Well, for one thing, as we take a look at a baby, and we say, what information processing capabilities does a baby have? And say, well, a baby doesn't even know how to walk or speak, right? But then that baby grows up and gets a PhD. And at that moment, they have considerably more intellectual capability, especially if they just happen to win an Olympic medal as well, okay? And so there is a difference in information processing capability between those two things. And so the question is, how could that difference in information processing capability possibly have come about? And psychologists are beginning to get ready to say, the way that happened is that the brain had to change itself. As we look at computer technology, the computers that we know are incapable of changing their hardware. So we have this distinction that we understand between hardware and software. But a computer can change its own software. And so it is my opinion that it is now appropriate for us to say, well, wait a minute, we see that the brain is changing itself, and that changes the information processing that it is capable of performing. And that when we make a metaphor, we have no idea how it's actually working. When we try to say, is there a computer in there? It looks like the answer is no. But frankly, the neuroscientists have not been looking very hard for computers because they've looked at it and say, well, it just doesn't look like there is one, all right? And so it's not clear that they've been looking hard enough to say that, well, we're absolutely certain that there is no software in the brain. But regardless of whether there is or is not actual software, it's appropriate to use the metaphor of software, because we understand that software is a way whereby an information processing device can change the rules whereby it works. And it is quite obvious that human beings change the rules whereby they work. And that, therefore, I like to talk about this as a metaphor of saying that you write your own software, okay? And that, therefore, when we talk about the uniqueness of the individual, what we mean is that each of us is a lot more different than we're used to thinking of each other, because the manufacturing technique is not to have a factory that produces identical human beings. The manufacturing technique that we use is a technique that produces every human being is different from everyone, and then you start as a baby, and then that baby itself produces all of the software that then allows that person to graduate with a PhD. And therefore, the way the information processing is done as adults is probably remarkably different from person to person. And so when we talk about primitive peoples and what they think about murder, and then compare that to someone here and say there's a conflict, no, I say there's no conflict. They're different people. You should ask the primitive people, what is the morality of killing them people, and say, well, it's a different tribe, so it's perfectly fine, okay? And then, but we don't have that idea, okay? And so I think I've gone on long enough, and yeah.
Go ahead.
So you speak about this subjective world, which includes, I think, intuition, spirituality, emotions, values, essentially. Am I on the right track there? And then there's the objective world, which is the information we gather from our senses, essentially. That's information. Information is what we gather from our senses and build up.
No, the objective world is the actual world that's outside of ourselves.
Right, so there's something then that the objective world we observe through our senses and we gather information from it, is that correct? Okay, so gathering this information, and then I think you said that information, when it gets complex enough, I don't remember exactly the word you said, manifests intuition?
No, no. This is when we have an information processing device,
right,
that we observe to be conscious, okay?
Which is the brain.
Well,
no?
when you have a conversation with someone, okay?
Okay.
So you observe this information processing device to be conscious, which just having a conversation with a computer, you'd say, well, yes, but that's the ELIZA program, and we know that's not conscious. Okay? But with people, we say, no, no, you know, we think they are conscious. But we can't measure it. We can't measure that you're really, you know, I can't measure that you're conscious, okay? When I ask a doctor, are you conscious? He then talks to you and says, hey, what day of the week is it? And you say, Sunday, and he says, yes, he's conscious, okay?
Okay.
And so what I'm saying is that in an information processing device that we observe to be conscious, that what causes the consciousness is that the information processing within the brain has a particular character that is different from the character that's going on in our computers, and that difference is such that the human spirit emerges as a phenomenon. Because I would suggest that the experience of being a human being and knowing that you're the same person today as you were yesterday, that is a new phenomenon that we observe that is very interesting and therefore exists. And that how does it work? And it appears that the way it works is that it is a phenomenon that emerges when the nature of the information processing is just the right kind of thing. And one of the things that it needs to do is it needs to be able to remember what you did yesterday. So that's just one small piece of what is needed.
Okay, so I guess my question is, just to draw it to the conclusion then, is do you believe then if these artificial intelligent computers, or whatever they evolve to be, but not organic brains anyway, if they get complex enough, do you believe there is a time when they could manifest a spiritual being, or could that...
Oh, absolutely.
So you do.
As a matter of fact, I believe that Alan Turing, Marvin Minsky, and John McCarthy, people who created the field of artificial intelligence, all believed that this was possible also. But I believe they're sitting there saying, okay, we're going to create an academic department and an engineering discipline, and so what should we call it? Should we call it artificial intelligence, or should we call it artificial consciousness? And so I sat back and said, well, let me see. And they say, well, I wonder what the economic value of consciousness is. And so I said, well, if you have a business and you need more consciousness, how much does it cost? Well, it costs minimum wage. So that's the cost of consciousness. And there's not a really huge problem with supply of consciousness, okay? But then with intelligence, you say, well, wait a minute, what is the economic value of intelligence? And it is more, and it's especially more when you see a company where the technology that they're using has matured, no one wants to study the field anymore, their experts are getting older, and there's no one coming up to study their expertise. That person's expertise needs to be put into software, into an expert system, and so, but that is intelligence. But it doesn't need to be conscious. It can just be, and the field of artificial intelligence discovered, no, we really don't need consciousness. At the beginning, they didn't know whether that was true or not. But I believe that there's another problem with an academic discipline. They had just created nuclear weapons in the physics, okay, as this field is being created. And so another question as you're creating a new academic field is, what are the moral problems? Are there moral problems with this field? So what are the moral problems of artificial consciousness? And frankly, one of the big problems with artificial consciousness is, can you turn it off? Isn't that immoral? Okay? And whereas then you say, well, are there moral problems with artificial intelligence? I say, well, as long as it's not conscious, then there aren't any problems. Okay? And so for both of those reasons, they decided to name the field artificial intelligence and to very carefully not cause artificial consciousness. And so today, as you talk about the future in which people become extinct because they've been replaced by computers, I would suggest that is not a future that we want. And what we want matters because we're the ones that make it happen. And our role in this should not be downplayed. And we should be very careful. It turns out that the information processing you are capable of is not just in your brain. Just as the strength of someone who's building the highway is not just in their muscles. The person building the highway is driving this huge machine. That is their strength, okay? And so for all of us in this room, your ability to process information includes your smartphone, your laptop, and your desktop computers, and the access to the internet, okay? And so today, when we're processing information, the first thing we do is we look it up in Wikipedia. We look at other things on the internet. We're using half the computers in the entire world in order to help us enhance our information processing capability. And so when we're competing against a computer, that computer has no better information processing ability than you have because you have a computer. And so there's no need for us to think of ourselves as inferior. And as a matter of fact, what the computers want doesn't matter. And should the computers even want anything? My answer is no. We should not create, and there's this whole literature of Frankenstein, the Frankenstein literature. So the movie War Games was about this. The world movie 2001: The Space Odyssey was about this. The basic result of all this is if you create an artificial intelligence, do not connect it to either the life support system or the weapon system. All right? And I think that is very good advice. And that's just to artificial, that even applies to artificial intelligence, let alone artificial consciousness. With artificial consciousness, you have the problem that, okay, it wants something now. And what it wants is us to be extinct. Okay?
Thanks. Interesting. You've provided some kind of different or new ways to think about some of these issues. So I find that very useful. Getting back to a couple paragraphs ago, what we want is important, okay? But different people and different groups all want different things. So getting back to, there's the science and there's humanities. But then we talk about rational and we talk about values. And this gets to artificial intelligence, also among movements that feel they're so rational, Artificial intelligence implies something that's going to make the right decisions. However, the right decisions are based on values, and you can't put them into a computer because they vary all over the place. So how do you deal with that complexity, that dilemma?
All right. Well, first of all, artificial intelligence does not imply that it's correct. Okay?
It does to most people.
No, but to most, that doesn't matter. Right? The fact that most people are wrong about that is perfectly clear. Okay? But if you've created an expert system, so it is now doing medical diagnosis, it is being used by a doctor, and when it gives to the doctor an incorrect diagnosis, the doctor says, well, that's ridiculous. I'm not paying attention to that. It's obviously that the proper diagnosis is this thing over here, okay? Because, and I don't know why the software neglected to mention, to take into account this one little factor that makes it obvious that its diagnosis is completely wrong, all right? So, number one. Second of all, no, values can be placed into a computer. The problem is once they've been placed into the computer, they don't necessarily match your values. And that's then a problem, okay? But you also mentioned that different people have different values. Yes, that's correct. How do we deal with that? Well, we have ways of dealing with that. Some people get put in jail, okay? And but in many cases, the existence of different values by different people is considered to be part of the freedom of the individual, and that you have a human right to have different values from other people, as long as you're not going around murdering people, okay? Or, you know, as long as you're not breaking the law, then your value system is just fine. And we're able to put together societies and whatnot based on that. So we've got ways of dealing with this, ways of coming together, ways of cooperating that allows the human enterprise to be able, I mean, we've just gotten to the point where we now know how to prevent an asteroid from wiping out human life on Earth. And so we've pretty much got that under control at this point. But and that's an achievement of technology. That there are an awful lot of people who don't fully appreciate the magnitude of that technological achievement.
I believe that the time that transcendentalism became came to us is a very powerful time, and that history and that what happened at that time is important to us today, because we're in a time where the computer electronics world is trying to dominate our thinking, and we need to learn from that. Recently, we had there was an electronics and health conference. Oh, by the way, the last thing is the whole concept of electronics and modern medicine dominating our culture is something that we need to be addressing, and the transcendental movement we can look at that to find answers. This conference was put on by the Santa Clara Valley Medical Foundation, and it was put on because there are so many doctors here that are so concerned about what's happening to the brain, especially of children, from electronics. There is 65% more autism in the Valley since 2000. And so there were 8 speakers from all over the country, top PhD speakers and doctors, and wonderful conversation, and it was sold out, and should be repeated. I have the conference proceedings, but anyway, the doctors get these children that are 8 or 10, and they're saying that they only can speak 2 words in their whole life together, 2 words. And so what they do is, for the healing, it's not medical, it's not chemicals, it is putting them into nature and say, put this child, no electronics for that child for 2 weeks. Put them into a nature camp, a garden, a park, but keep them in nature for 2 weeks. And at the end of that time, the child comes back, and for the first time in their life, they can speak a full sentence, and it continues. You know, this whole issue, Steve Jobs says, the true revolution will come when biology and technology come into balance. We are not... we need to try to find that balance here in our culture, in our society. And nature and the ecology and the interrelationship of all of life is important for us to do that and to be connected to it. But we don't see it anywhere in this valley. We have to go to the mountains rather than on a regular basis. So the healing of our minds... So my question is what do you think about this? What have you got to say about what I've just said? Thank you.
Well, there's some key elements that you've raised that I absolutely agree with. And in particular, the part that I really agree with is that we need to, that there's been an overemphasis on logical thinking and scientific approach. It's not that that was necessarily wrong, but we've traveled on a pendulum far enough in that direction. And in the struggle between the sciences and the humanities, we have failed to understand the strengths of the humanities. And to my way of thinking, the key element here is that we have refused to acknowledge that the human's the subjective life, is a real phenomenon that exists in natural law and is a scientific fact, okay? And that is a scientific fact, but it is a scientific fact that you cannot understand by understanding the software that causes it to occur. The best way to understand human subjectivity is through talking to people, empathizing with them, and interacting with other people as people within the humanities and the arts do. Because subjective being is just such an incredibly complex phenomenon. It is too complicated to understand by understanding the natural law. And we need to recognize that that is true and to say, aha, when we are, and to then recognize that the big difference between the sciences and the humanities is that the humanities are part of the subject, is to connect with and influence the subjective lives of the people who interact with that discipline. In the sciences, that's not the subject matter. The subject matter is discovering what is the natural law whereby things work. So you can have a science of subjective life, but that science of subjective life is not going to tell you how to make a hit show. In order to have a hit show, you need an artist who uses empathy and artistry and creates a hit show. Right? Now, with regard to autism, it turns out that my daughter-in-law has a business serving autistic people. And I don't know, I went to MIT. Turns out that the movie War Games has a number of kids in it, sort of college-age kids. And it turns out they are all stereotypes of various MIT students. And I'm able to identify the names of the students that they are stereotypes of, okay? And so, and part of what you see at MIT is you see a large percent, well, it turns out that the autism spectrum now goes from the nearly disabled, as you were describing, all the way up to just short of normal, okay? And there is a significant section of that spectrum that is able to do very well at MIT. And I know a lot of these people. I'm somewhere on the spectrum, but I'm very, very close to normal, okay? And Albert Einstein, I believe, was further away from normal than I am, okay? But part of this diagnosis, I sometimes worry that since we've now acknowledged what used to be called Asperger's, we now include that as part of the autistic spectrum, we then say, oh, 82% of people are autistic, but that means we're talking about people just short of normal who will do very well at MIT. I'm saying, well, wait a minute. These people don't need the same kind of help as the people that you were describing who really do need some help. And frankly, my daughter-in-law has a business that helps them.
Hello. Hi. Hi, Peter. I'm here. Here.
There we go. There we are.
Hi, I'm Carlos Feder, and for those who knew you for many, many years, we are very glad to have you here. Also only for a short transient moment, So I remember for more than 10 years ago, we created a kind of small choir at our home and rehearsed it to sing Christmas songs, but we changed lyrics to secular terms, And there you were a member with your nice voice and values, and everything else, you know. So today you gave us a excellent, wonderful talk, you know. Also your answers were very, very excellent, you know. And you took us through several centuries of evolution of humanity. Now my question is only, do you have that published somewhere, or can we get that in internet to digest it a little bit more? That's my question.
Right. So that was published. My essay was published in the Philosophies in the Essays in the Philosophy of Humanism, which is an academically refereed journal, which means that it's surprisingly expensive to lay your hands on it, unless you are work for a university. So people who work for a university say, "Oh yeah, no problem getting that," but everyone else says, "I looked up and I saw how much it cost." I said, do I need to pay that much just to get a paper, for crying out loud? And so there's a little difficulty here. So frankly, the best way for you to get, well, for one thing, you can send me an email. I can send you a copy of my paper. It's very important that we not publish this on the internet, because this is academic publishing. If it gets published on the internet, then they say, well, then they don't have to pay for our academic journal to get the article, even though the only people who pay the academic journal are universities anyway, okay? And so the actual professors don't actually, I don't think they actually pay this individually. The fact that they're on the faculty of the university gives them access to this, because a university has a subscription to the magazine, okay? But, so they have told me that that as long as you're not like someone for whom this is a professional interest, then I can send you a copy, a PDF file. But most of what's in my article, except for all this talk about the science of well, they're all the footnotes. So you did not get my footnotes. So everything that I talked about is heavily footnoted. So if you want the footnotes, then you need the PDF file. But the video that we have for today will be accessible to you, and I encourage you to use that. But again, you can send me an email. I'll be happy to send people. But please do not put it on the internet. That's all. Okay. Yeah. And I have a website. Unfortunately, I've been very bad about trying to put content on the website, and that's because my ideas are still bubbling a lot. And so.
Okay, you talked about the human consciousness as a sort of a software function, and talked about it from the individual point of view. Have you thought about the collective consciousness, being a software function, and the model where we're sort of part of a network computer, sort of like Google is, So Google is a phenomenon that involves millions of computers. And so things like, government, religion, humanists, neighborhood associations, all these little sub, organizations, are sort of, their own consciousness and life forms, and are subject to the evolution and things like that. Do you have any thoughts on group?
Yeah. So So about the collective unconscious. When we talk about human consciousness, this is something that we experience ourselves. If we didn't experience our own consciousness, let me tell you, a computer scientist would look at a computer and say, no way is this going to happen. All right? This is completely unintuitive that information processing would result in a computer that would say, I am. I think, therefore I am. Right? That's not what a computer would do, okay? And it certainly, and even if it did do it, it would just be saying it, because it's echoing Descartes. It wouldn't have the fact that there's our being is like a huge surprise from a scientific standpoint, except that it shouldn't be a surprise, because each one of us experiences ourselves. We experience the relationships with all the people. We know that all of the people that we know, all are conscious. We know our cats are conscious, our dogs are conscious, our horses are conscious, but at lesser degrees, and they can't talk to us. But those pets people love their pets and they know their pets love them, and so they know there is a consciousness there. We're not quite so sure about the ants, okay? But
or the president.
Yes, the president is another matter. But and so when that's, we know that that is real. With regard to the collective unconsciousness, it's quite clear that people do communicate with each other. But do we communicate with each other telepathically? And the answer is no, as far as we can tell. And lots of people have asked that question very, very seriously, tried to figure out if it's happening, and you say, okay, what is the technology? What is the Ethernet technology that supports telepathy? And you say, no, I'm sorry, that doesn't work. When we take a look at the electromagnetic radiations coming out of the mind, any telepathy could not possibly be based on electromagnetic radiations because we know a lot. In electrical engineering, we know a lot about electromagnetic radiation. We know almost everything about electromagnetic radiation. And so there's no telepathy happening via electromagnetic radiation. So it's not a wireless signal, okay? So what would it be? And there's more thought that, well, we do know that people talk to each other. Not only do people talk, they write books, they have cultures, and so this culture then does form a kind of an internet. You have probably modified content that is on the internet. So you have probably contributed to the internet yourself, okay? And so there are these forms of communication that we know about, but does that cause a consciousness? I don't think we have any, there's nothing from the internet saying, I am, and this is what I want. Okay, that says to me, no, there's no that's not a consciousness. It is a culture. It is something, and our experience of the collective unconscious is more of, I think, an experience of empathy with other people. You want to be in community with other people, and that is very real. But that is part of our socialization, and our mind is doing its best to communicate with other people. So that's my thinking.
We have time for one last question.
Okay. Being a scientist, we are products of our brains. And the scientists not only study the external world, they heavily are studying our brains as well. So from that perspective, I kind of disagree that the scientists just follow the external world. And if you look at the brain, not only we study the neurological, but also psychiatry. So all our behavioral patterns and all these stuff are directed by our brains. So the scientists study that, and based on that, we are still at a very preliminary stage because the brain is the most difficult part to study because we are studying our brain without brain. So there are a lot of challenges there. But scientists are not set apart from the surrounding environment. So can you comment on that?
Yeah. So obviously, there's a reason why we do science. And the reason we do science is that we will understand the world outside of ourselves. As we're thinking about something we might do, a very important issue with regard to should we do that is what are the consequences? And it turns out that science helps us figure out what the consequences of our actions are going to be. And that's very important. Without science, we'd be virtually clueless about what they might be. We certainly wouldn't know how to build a computer. You definitely wouldn't have any cell phones, okay? And yes, there are a lot of people studying the brain, and that's actually going along quite nicely. However, the approach from MIT has largely been downgraded significantly. And so as I look at that, because I'm watching what's going on at the University of Maryland with regard to this, who has a very nice interdisciplinary group in this area, they seem to have lost track of rational emotive therapy and focusing. Therefore, they have lost track of all of the psychological understanding of intuition. And so they are basically nowhere on intuition. They don't even have a theory that explains why we have the term value system. And the reason we have the term value system is because our brain is doing what I just described it as doing. Okay? And so that's not part of their theory. So they still have a long way to go. To my way of thinking, artificial intelligence has something to contribute here. Because when we design complex information systems, we design them from the bottom up, but we also design them from the top down, and we design them from the middle out. The brain is so complicated. It is time for the neuroscientists to ask the computer people, hey, you guys know something about complex information processing. Do you have any words of advice for us? And then to take some of those words of advice seriously, okay? And then in addition, the other thing we can do is that in artificial intelligence, all the time we are talking to people and reverse engineering the information processing they are doing in order to create expert systems. So part of the field of artificial intelligence is to do top-down analysis of the human brain. We could be contributing to this at this level. As I suggest in my paper, that leads you to describing what is a value system and how is it working, okay? And so that's just a very simple, that's practically the first thing you think of from an AI perspective, and there's room for there to be a lot of work there. I'm not seeing anyone interested in that work being done, partly because they're still arguing about, is the nature of the human consciousness, is this a computational theory of mind? And I want to take it past the computational theory of mind to a software theory of mind that says that the difference between the baby and the person who graduates from college is that the mind changed itself, which we can have as a metaphor for having written software, regardless of what it did. And we know that there were lots of neurons that got changed in that process. But there might have been some software involved, and a much more wonderful appreciation that in complex information processing systems, it is very easy to have multiple levels of abstraction. And in our computers, when you have a virtual reality, the abstraction above that level of abstraction has nothing to do whatsoever with everything that's happening below it. And so this whole idea that a drug, you should give a computer a drug to make Microsoft Word work better is like totally ridiculous and actually won't even work. Obviously, there is some leakage within the human brain because you can give people drugs that will affect some of this high-level thinking. So there is some, there's definitely a big difference here. And we don't understand why that is different. So there's a lot we don't understand. And to my way of thinking, there's room for there to be top-down work. That top-down work eventually will meet with the bottoms-up work. Once it meets, then we'll know what the real answer is.
All right, let's thank the speaker. Time is up.